Welcome to my YouTube channel, One Race, Human Race, All Human. Today is Wednesday, June 29th, 2022.
We tend to think about January 6th as unprecedented because in many ways it was. We've never seen the Capitol ransacked by insurrectionists. We've never had a coup at the federal level. Which is why watching it in real time felt so surreal. Like, is this actually happening? But as we learn more about what it was, essentially a violent right-wing mob refusing to accept defeat at the ballot box by a multiracial coalition and storming the seat of government to take it over by force, it's clear this is actually a pre-existing script in American political life. It's not one we're taught in school, but this blueprint has existed in this very way, particularly in the South, in the years after the Civil War. Immediately after the war ended, of course, the southern states were under federal occupation. Formerly enslaved people were freed, given the right to vote. And these places in the South began to see a new form of multiracial coalition politics, black-white fusion elected governments throughout the South, from the municipal level all the way on up. And those governments were opposed by the dead-end reactionary white racist old guard. And what happened in those years, again and again and again, is that the multiracial party, at that time the Republican Party, with white and black voters, they were in power, and the Democrats of the era would say elections were stolen, that there was fraud after an election. They would assemble armed mobs to march on local government in order to wrest the power back into their control. And it was fully understood at the time that that's what happened. One newspaper, 1874, read, quote, "The condition of the South is by no means reassuring." This, of course, from a Republican paper. "There is an evident determination shown in several of the states to intimidate black voters, and by the process of intimidation to secure a monopoly of political power to the whites." Now, that story ran just 2 days after one of the most infamous examples. It was called the Battle of Liberty Place. It happened in New Orleans in 1874. Again, this is prime Reconstruction, right? The South is still under federal occupation. The details, they're going to sound familiar. So there was an election. There were accusations of voter fraud by the reactionary white party, who then turned to calls for street action. Here's one such call. It was reprinted in a local paper. It called on people to amass in the streets, saying, quote, "You have been the silent but indignant sufferers of outrage after outrage heaped upon you by a usurping government." Well, the white supremacist militia movement responded to that call, gathering to overturn the state government and put the losing candidate in office. And the New Orleans Metropolitan Police were put on a war footing because, quote, "it was believed that the white league clubs meant business and no mistake. It was known these clubs were pretty well armed, determined to make a stand. These were the Proud Boys of their time." And the police of New Orleans were right to be worried because, lo and behold, later that day, quote, "the various companies of the White League, armed with every variety of weapon, appeared in the streets, taking positions in various portions of the city." And they attacked the police. Multiple police officers were killed. And by the following day, the old officials from the Republican Party, right, the Democrat, the multiracial party, they'd been deposed, and the state house seized by the white supremacist party. And the pro-coup papers celebrated the victory with language that, again, is going to sound very familiar. Noting the, quote, "dozen gallant lives sacrificed on the altar of liberty, the blood of gentlemen and patriots that have been shed," and that, quote, "Louisiana throughout its borders today is free." Eventually, it took federal troops to restore order, as so often happened, but it was a huge deal at the time. I mean, chronicles and newspapers from Louisiana and New York, and it happened just a year after the notorious Colfax Massacre, which was also in Louisiana, where the same group, the White League, captured a federal courthouse defended by an all-black militia and murdered dozens of African Americans. And atrocities like that one kept happening. Armed white supremacist mobs trying to overthrow democratically elected local governments all the way through the latter half of the 19th century. You know, they actually succeeded in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina. This one is less famous, less well-known. But the mob took to the streets, shooting and killing an untold number of black citizens. But what their aim was that they physically occupied the local government. They took over the local government, and they expelled the black politicians, and they put unelected white men into place in the city government instead. And you go back to those moments in American history, Liberty Place and Colfax and Wilmington, and it really helps to clarify what we saw on January 6th. The seditious tradition in American life, and the very real warning signs of what was actually happening, seen and documented by people at the time. And remember, those tactics, the armed violence and the coups, the attempt to overturn elected government, like in Wilmington, it worked over time. It worked. And the free black people in the South, many of those jurisdictions, didn't see their freedom, their true democratic rights, again for another 80 years. Those are the stakes. That's what happens if the mob is allowed to rule without repercussions. That is All In on this Wednesday night. MSNBC Prime starts now with Ali Velshi. Good evening, Ali.
Very thoughtful, Chris. Thank you for that. And
Welcome to our YouTube channel, One Race, Human Race, All Human. Today is Wednesday, June 29th, 2022. To learn more, listen to Reverend Dr. Martin King Jr.'s March 25th, 1965 speech there at Montgomery on voting rights. He talks about the fusion coalitions of blacks and whites together and how they were voting together. And one reason they brought in Jim Crow segregation was to stop blacks and whites from meeting together and voting their economics, not color, but voting economics. And he mentioned the book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Thank you for being on my YouTube channel, One Race, Human Race, All Human. Remember, there's one race, the human race, and everyone has a right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Everyone on this planet known as Earth.